The wind came in hard from the north, scouring the plains with a voice like old bones grinding. It rattled the shutters on the Hell Ranch, curled under doors, and carried with it the faintest sound, thin, high, and desperate. Judson Hell had lived alone for 7 winters now, and he'd learned to ignore most things, coyote calls, whispers of storms, dreams. But this sound didn't belong to any of those. It was too human, too fragile. A baby screamed, distant but rising. He stood in the doorway, hat low against the sunless sky, and listened. It came again sharper this time, urgent and small. He narrowed his eyes toward the far edge of the property, where the trail gave out and the cottonwoods leaned like tired, old ghosts. He didn't move at first, just stood there, boots planted, jaw set like carved granite. But the cry came again, and it didn't stop. Judson grabbed his coat from the nail, slung his rifle over his shoulder, though he doubted it. Wolveson started walking toward the fence line. The wagon came into view in pieces. First the wheel, half buried in churned mud. Then the canvas, ripped and flapping. Then the shape slumped over the reins, unmoving. She looked more like a shadow than a woman. Her long braid was caked in red, clay hanging like a rope from her shoulder. Blood had dried at her temple, cracked like riverbeds in August. One arm dangled from the seat. The other barely clutched the side of the wagon, as if she'd tried to stay upright before surrendering to whatever came. The baby was behind her, nestled in a wooden crate lined with wool and rags. His face was blotched and furious, fists waving. In the cold, Judson didn't speak, didn't curse. Just moved. He reached the woman first, pressed 2 fingers gently to her neck. A pulse faint, unsteady, but there. She wasn't gone, not yet. She was small, but not light. Dead weight always felt heavier. He gathered her carefully, one arm under her. Legs, one around her back, her head lolled against his chest. Blood from her scalp soaked into his shirt, smelled sweat, dust, smoke hand, something else. Sage, maybe? Duh. The baby screamed louder. Judson hesitated, looked at the child. A boy, maybe 3 or 4 months old, pale eyes, wet cheeks. His tiny chest heaved like a bird fighting the wind. Judson nodded once, almost to himself, then turned toward the house. It took 2 trips. First the woman, then the baby, bundled. In a saddle blanket, by the time he got them inside, the wind had risen into a full howl. The door slammed shut behind him like judgment. Inside, the fire had died 2 coals. He laid the woman on the cot near the stove and covered her with an old quilt, his wife's, though he didn't think about that, not yet. He stoked the fire. With one hand held the baby, with the other, rocked him once. Twice the crying slowed. Judson's fingers were stiff, awkward, but the child didn't fight him. He found an old kettle, poured water, added a splash of goat's milk, tested the warmth on his wrists like he'd seen Sarah do all those years ago. The baby drank. The woman didn't wake. Judson stared at her face. Noticed the earring's turquoise drops, the necklace of bone and leather, of Comanche, by the look of her, maybe more. That would mean trouble. He stepped back, looked at the fire. Then at the child asleep in the crook of his arm. There had been another baby once. Another quilt. Another set of tiny lungs that gave out before their first storm. Judson set the boy down gently in a wooden crate he lined with sheepskin. He sat in the rocking chair across from the cot, eyes fixed on the woman who'd fallen into his silence like a ghost on horseback. He didn't know who she was. Didn't know who had tried to kill her. But he knew this. She would not die here. Not under his roof. Not like this. Outside. The wind screamed against the walls, begging to be let in. Inside, Judson Hale watched the firelight dance across the baby's face and said nothing. The fever broke on the 3rd morning. Her breath, once ragged and shallow, came easier now, though her lips were cracked and dry. Sweat had soaked through the quilt and dried again. She opened her eyes slowly, blinking at the flickering firelight. On the ceiling beams, somewhere nearby, wood creaked and metal clinked against metal. The smell of coffee drifted in, bitter, strong. She turned her head toward it and winced. Her ribs ached. Her scalp burned. But she was alive. Was unfamiliar. Sparse but clean. Stone hearth, tin kettle, shelves lined with jars, a small table worn smooth by years of elbows. There were no photographs, only a single dried flower pressed into a glass frame. Its petals faded to the color of old parchment. She tried to sit up. A wave of dizziness caught her, and she slumped back. The blanket slid off her shoulder, revealing her tattered dress and the bruises along her collarbone. She pulled the quilt tighter. The baby stirred beside her in a crate padded with wool. His cheeks were pink now. He didn't cry, just made a soft sound, like a hiccup swallowed by sleep. One tiny fist clutched a ribbon, sky blue, frayed at the ends, the only thing she'd managed to grab before the world turned red and screaming. Through the window, she saw him, the white man. He stood by the wagon, sleeves rolled to the elbow, hands working over the wheel, like he was coaxing it back to life. The sun caught on the silver streak in his beard. He moved with the weight of someone who didn't talk to many people anymore. Lena didn't know what to think. She didn't know why he'd brought her here, why he'd fed her, covered her, kept the child warm. She remembered the men on the trail, the rifles. The sound of her husband's voice cut short, the thud of bodies hitting the dirt. After that, only pain and the distant echo of the baby's cry until the strangers' arms lifted her, strong and careful. He hadn't said a word since. He didn't ask her name. She didn't know his. He came in not long after, saw she was awake, paused in the doorway like he wasn't sure if she'd vanish if he stepped closer. He didn't smile, but he didn't frown either. Just set a mug of water and another of broth on the table and nodded. She nodded back. Her voice wouldn't come. He went back outside and she listened to his footsteps fade over the porch. The same porch her baby now slept beside. Later, she stood at the window, weak but upright, and watched him lift a saddle from the fence post. He ran his hand along the leather, gentle, almost reverent, before setting it down. He moved slower than most men she'd known, like time didn't press him anymore. Lena's hand drifted down to her belly, where the pain still sat like a stone. Then to her son's soft hair. She didn't know what he expected of her. She didn't know what would happen when she was strong enough to leave. Judson, outside, worked with his back to the wind. He didn't look at the house. Not once. His thoughts were far off. Buried beneath old dirt and winter graves. 7 years ago, he'd buried a boy no older than the one crying in the crate now. Dug the hole himself. The wind that day had howled the same way it did now, like it was mourning something older than bones. The tools he used now had once been Sarah's father's. She'd made Judson promise to keep them oiled, and he had, even after she died. Even after the house went quiet. In the barn, her wedding dress still hung from a rusted nail, yellowed with dust. He hadn't touched it. Inside, the fire popped. The baby stirred. He heard it just like he always did. Even in his sleep, even when it wasn't crying. Mercy wasn't a word Judson ever used. But he felt something in his chest every time he looked at the boy's fist around that blue ribbon. He didn't know what it was. But he didn't look away. Asterisk. The storm rolled in heavy and sudden, pressing down on the land like a clenched fist. Clouds blackened the sky without warning, swallowing the late afternoon light. The wind hit the windows first, sharp, insistent, rattling the old glass with every gust. Then came the smell of ozone, sharp and metallic, like blood on iron. Lena stood at the hearth, her baby pressed tight against her chest. She'd been tense all day, her eyes flitting toward the horizon even before the first thunder groaned. Now she rocked slowly, arms locked, whispering in low, rhythmic Comanche that barely broke the silence. The words weren't meant for anyone else, just her. Just him. Judson watched from the doorway, one hand braced against the frame, hat in the other. He hadn't lit the lanterns yet. The house was cast in a strange light, fire glow and shadow, trembling between warmth and darkness. Lightning cracked the sky open. The thunder that followed sounded like a tree splitting from the inside. Lena flinched. The baby let out a sharp wail, then sobbed against her collarbone. Judson stepped back inside, quiet. His boots didn't even thump. She didn't look at him. He walked over to the shelf and picked up a folded wool blanket, thick, hand-stitched, edges fraying. Without a word, he crossed the room and held it out. She hesitated, eyes fixed on his face for the first time. That day she didn't speak, but she took the blanket. He nodded once and turned away, back to the chair by the window where he could watch the rain tear across the fields. His rifle leaned nearby, untouched. He didn't need it tonight. What they were fighting wasn't the kind of thing Lead could stop. The wind howled around the house, yanking at the roof like it wanted in. Lena paced now, barefoot, her hair unbraided for the first time, a thick curtain trailing behind her. The baby whimpered, restless. She shifted him from one hip to the other, whispering again. Judson caught fragments. They meant nothing to him, but the rhythm was soft, soothing. He hadn't heard a voice like that in years. At one point, Lena began to hum. The sound was more breath than music, a lullaby caught between sorrow and comfort. Judson didn't turn. His head just listened. The fire snapped. Rain battered the roof like it was trying to wash the world away. He thought of the last storm like this, the one that flooded the barn, spoiled the winter feed. Sarah had been alive then, barely. She'd stood at this same window, watching the lightning fork across the prairie, one hand on her stomach, the other holding the teacup that would slip from her grip the next day. He closed his eyes, breathed deep, and opened them again. Lena had stopped pacing. She'd sunk into the corner rocker, the baby finally asleep against her shoulder. She looked half exhausted, half alert, like sleep was a risk she couldn't afford. Her eyes flicked too. Him once. He didn't smile, didn't nod, but he didn't look away. The fire lit half her face in gold and shadow. Across her brow was a thin scar, just beneath her hairline. On her left arm, another long and clean, the kind a knife makes when someone's trying to be quick. She didn't hide them. He saw them anyway. He reached over and tossed another log into the fire. The room brightened. The flames stretched taller, reflected in both their eyes. Outside, the rain softened. Still steady, but no longer savage. The worst had passed. Judson leaned back in his chair and watched the flames settle. He could still hear the baby breathing, soft, rhythmic, and Lena's hum. Even though it had stopped, they didn't speak, but in that silence something shifted. A thread, fine and nearly invisible, tugged between two people who had no reason to trust each other and every reason to stay. He reached for his coffee, took a slow sip, and looked toward the cradle. Not trust. Not yet, but something. Recognition. The days settled like dust after a cattle stampede, slow, restless, thick with things left unsaid. Lena moved through the cabin with more strength now, her steps steadier, her hands busier. She swept the floors each morning, careful not to disturb the worn places where time had carved itself into the boards. She fed the chickens, checked the water, even tried to sew a rip in Judson's shirt left folded near the stove. He noticed, of course he did. But when he saw her with the needle, he took the shirt without a word and tossed it across the back of a chair. Not cruel, just final. Lena didn't ask why. She knew. Judson wasn't used to kindness. Not the kind that showed up soft and steady, with no debt attached. Not the kind that lingered in the house like bread baking or bare feet padding across wood at dusk. He moved around her like a man trying not to startle a wild thing, or maybe like a wild thing himself. They spoke only when needed, said water, and pointed to the well. She said firewood, and nodded toward the shed. Words were functional, heavy, not wasted. Still glances passed between them like smoke from a chimney brief, curling, vanishing before either could name what they meant. Judson spent most days patching the roof. The latter groaned under his weight as he moved from one broken shingle to the next. Lena watched him from the window, her flour-covered hands shaping dough into small, imperfect loaves. She didn't anymore. But the silence between them felt less sharp than before. Then the baby fell ill. It started with a cry that didn't sound right. Not full-throated, not hungry, just Wrong. His skin turned too hot, and his eyes lost their shine. Lena's arms shook as she held him, his body limp against hers.
Hey.
She didn't know what to do, only that something was slipping, and she couldn't stop it. Judson saw her panic, saw the terror she tried to swallow. He didn't speak, he just saddled the horse. She followed him to the barn, holding the baby against her chest, lips pressed to the child's hair. The sky was darkening, storm, or no storm, and the wind had a bite to it. Judson tied off the reins, checked the cinch, then turned to her. She didn't plead, didn't cry. She just looked at him like he was the last road left. He nodded once, mounted and rode. The hooves faded into night. The hours that followed stretched like rope pulled tight. Lena sat by the fire, rocking the baby, wiping his brow with damp cloths. She whispered stories in Comanche, stories her mother once told her. Her voice cracked, her eyes stayed dry.
Door.
The wind shifted sometime before dawn. Lena looked up and listened. Then hooves returned, soaked to the skin, face gray with exhaustion, hands trembling as he dismounted. His saddlebag bulged with jars and powder, cloth-wrapped bottles, clinking together. He didn't speak as he handed them over, didn't ask how the baby was. Just brushed past her and leaned against the wall, breathing like he'd outrun death. She made the poultice exactly as the trader had written, applied it to the baby's chest, fed him drops from the bottle, counting seconds between breaths. By morning, the child's color had started to return. Judson hadn't slept, just sat at the table, staring out the window at nothing. Lena didn't thank him. But that night, when the baby was finally resting, she left something at his door. Folded cloth, a shirt. Small, hand-stitched, made from the edge of her own dress. Soft seams. Careful work. Judson picked it up with calloused hands, turned it over once, twice. His thumb brushed the neckline, the tiny loops at the collar. Perfect, but made with care. He looked at it for a long time, then without a word walked over to the mantel. Beside a faded photograph of his wife, he set it down. He didn't know what that meant, but it felt like something was beginning. The wind had stilled outside for once. The fire inside popped softly, sending little sparks upward in bursts of orange and gold. Shadows stretched long across the wooden floor, flickering against the walls like memories too stubborn to fade. The cabin was quiet, not with tension, not anymore, but with something more fragile. Something earned. The baby slept, bundled snug near the hearth in the crate Judson had lined with a sheep's pelt days ago. His breath came slow and even. Now tiny fingers curled near his mouth. Lena sat with her knees tucked under her, back resting lightly against the wall. Her dress hung loose around her frame, sleeves rolled, hair freshly braided. One tie loose at the end. Judson sat on the opposite side of the fire, elbows on his knees, hands wrapped around a mug that had long gone cold. His eyes watched the flames. But his mind wasn't in the room. Neither of them had spoken in an hour. It wasn't silence that filled the space. It was everything else. Shared moments. Half glances. It's the memory of a baby's fevered breath and a galloping horse through night. Lena shifted, lifting her chin. She looked at him carefully, almost like testing the weight of the words before they left her tongue. Why? Did you help me? Her voice was quiet, thick with accent, but clear. Judson didn't answer right away. His eyes stayed on the fire as if the flames might shape his reply for him. The wood cracked. The baby sighed in his sleep. Then low and simple. Because no one helped mine. The words settled like ash. Lena watched him. Her face didn't change, but something in her posture did, a softening of the shoulders, a release of breath she hadn't noticed she was holding. She looked down for a moment, fingers brushing the edge of her skirt, then up again. Her eyes, dark and steady, held a weight he recognized. Not pity, not sympathy. Something quieter. Kinship. She raised one hand and placed it gently over her heart, then pointed to the baby. His father, she said slowly, was white. Judson's gaze met hers for the first time in minutes. He didn't flinch. He didn't speak. They hated us, she continued, fingers fumbling to shape each word. They called him a traitor, took him from me.
Ow.
Her voice wavered at the end. She didn't cry, but the pain lingered in the pauses, in the spaces between the words she had to borrow from another. Language Judson took in her story with a stillness that didn't ask for details. He didn't need them. Then maybe he said finally, "He belongs here." She blinked. It wasn't a declaration. It wasn't a promise, but it cracked something open between them. Lena looked back at the fire, her arms wrapped loosely around her knees. Judson leaned back in his chair, the wood creaking. Beneath him, their shadows danced again, slow and uncertain. It's like two figures circling without touching. Outside, stars had come out clean and cold and far away. Inside, the only sound was the fire burning down low, and the breathing of a child, too. Young to know he'd survived something meant to erase him. They didn't speak again that night, but neither of them moved from their place near the hearth, and neither of them felt alone anymore. The dust trailed behind the rider like smoke off a brush fire. Judson saw him coming from the rise, hat low, coat stiff, two riders behind him like shadows flanking a bad thought. His name was Clay Dorsey, a man who made his money fencing. Other men's cattle and breaking the backs of those too quiet to fight, he never came around unless there was something to take or something to break. Judson didn't move, stood on the porch, arms folded, a single nail clenched between his teeth where a cigar used to be. Inside, Lena froze mid-step, baby slung to her hip in a sling she'd sewn herself. She looked to Judson, waiting. The hooves stopped just shy of the fence line. "Aw, sheer." Dorsey didn't tip his hat. "I heard you're harboring a squaw up here," he said, "with a baby that ain't yours." Judson didn't reply. Dorsey spat. "That don't sit right. Not with the folks down valley. Ain't right. I'd start thinking your fence line could use a shift. I'd start wondering who that cattle really belongs to." Lena stepped onto the porch, quiet. Her presence alone made Dorsey's lip curl. She stood behind Judson, not hiding, just standing. Her eyes didn't leave the man's face. Judson dropped the nail into his palm, rolled it once between his fingers, then stepped down off the porch. "You'll ride off this land," he said, voice even low. "Like the beginning of thunder, or I'll bury you in it." It wasn't a threat. It wasn't even loud. But the stillness that followed was louder than any gunshot. Dorsey stared at him long, as if testing for a bluff. But he saw something in Judson Hale's eyes that made men pause. The silence stretched. Then Dorsey's horse shifted beneath him, impatient. One of his riders muttered something, and the moment snapped. Dorsey jerked his reins. "Suit yourself," he said. "This land'll rot around you anyhow." And he rode. When the dust settled, Judson turned and walked back inside without a word. That night, after the baby had fallen asleep in his box by the fire, Lena began packing. Slow, careful motions. She folded the child's small shirt, the blue ribbon, a scrap of dried lavender she'd tucked into her apron pocket. Her face was unreadable. Judson sat at the table, arms on his knees, watching. The fire had burned low. He waited until she picked up her shawl, then stood. She turned, startled to find him so close. He didn't say anything at first, just held something out in both hands. It was folded neatly, with the kind of care one gives to memories too painful to hold with bare fingers. A shawl, soft from time, pale with age. Roses stitched by hand along the edges. She looked down at it, then up at him. "It was Sarah's," he said, "but she'd rather it be worn than hang like a ghost." Lena didn't speak. Judson stepped closer. "I reckon this house is too quiet without a baby crying," he said, voice barely above the pop of the fire, "and I ain't ready to hear it stop." Her throat moved, but no words came. For the shawl with both hands, cradled it to her chest like a second child, stood there, still. In that moment, no promises were made, no confessions offered, but something passed between them, solid and unshakable. The next morning, Judson rose early. He saddled both horses, tied down a basket with milk, bread, and cloth. Lena stepped outside with the baby bundled close, her braid tucked into the same shawl, now worn across her shoulders like armor. They didn't speak as they rode into town, but they didn't need to. By the time the sun cleared the pines, the clerk at the county office was scribbling down the boy's name. Judson spelled it slow and sure. The last name was Hale.